Hey Landscape Lighting World, this is Mike from Sonoran Lighting Supply and lightingwholesaler.com. Today's Tech Tip Tuesday is brought to you from the road as I'm traveling right now, but we're gonna take a page out of the best practices manual and talk about using your amp probe and voltmeter or multimeter. So long forgotten tool, I feel like lately now with LEDs, but just as important as ever. So with an amp probe or a multimeter, we're able to check three things: primary voltage, secondary voltage. You can check, four things: amperage on the low voltage side or amperage on the line voltage side. So technically we always use the critical three. So primary amps, secondary amps, voltage at point of connection, but it's also important to check that fourth being the primary volts. The reason for this is it's a 10-to-1 ratio. So if you have 120 volts at your outlet, you have 12 volts at your 12 volt tap. If you have 130 volts of power at your outlet, you have 13 volts on your 12 volt tap. So it's a direct correlation, 10%. With amperage, it's the same thing. So let's say, how would I use this? So using my amp probe, I could do a couple of things. I can make sure, my transformer is not overloaded. You just simply take your transformer, you put it on your power coming into the transformer. So on different models, different manufacturers, they might have it coming into a power tap or it's a cord. So in that case, you would use like the photocell loop and put your amp probe around that. And you're going to make sure that you're not overloaded on the transformer. So if it's a 300 watt transformer, different manufacturers say you can go up, they might derate larger transformers. So they say you can actually go 300 watts of power on a 300 watt transformer. Others will tell you 80%. So whatever that is, this is 2.94, if it's 3 amps or whatever it is, just make sure you're never overloaded. Use your amp probe, look at the information card typically found on the inside of the transformer lid, and make sure you're not overloaded there. Next, let's go to the low voltage side. So you take your amp probe, you can put on a home run. Let's say I'm using 12 gauge wire. Typically, 12 gauge wire, you are at a 20 amp maximum. 80% of that is 16 amps. So again, National Electric Code, always remember that 80% rule. So make sure you're not overloaded on the home run. Take your amp probe, put it on the home run, either the hot or the common at the transformer. Doesn't matter which side. It's alternating current, so that current travels both directions. And you're gonna make sure you're not over your 16 amps. If it's 10 gauge wire, it's a different rating. So, or if it's 14, again, National Electric Code, you can't use something lower than a 14 gauge wire. So 14, 12, and 10 those are your main choices, unless you're gonna go some crazy like 8 gauge or you have some scenario that you're going real far. And then you're gonna use your voltmeter, of course, on the alternating current setting. And you're gonna go and you're gonna check the voltage at your first connection, your second, third, whatever it is. If it's a hub method, you're gonna check your voltage at the hub method. But you ultimately wanna make sure that the highest fixture isn't over that 15 volt mark or 18 volt mark, which I'm gonna say like probably 90% of the manufacturers out there, their high voltage requirement or maximum voltage is allowable is 18 volts. And on your low side is somewhere usually around that 10. So make sure you're no lower than 10, no higher than 18. Again, reference your manufacturers that you're using, their spec sheets. They'll tell you what their voltage range is. So here's what's really cool. So if you've gone through and you've done all these things, and as far as documenting, not only just checking, but documenting this transformer, I'm not overloaded. I'm at this much amperage on my primary. I'm at this much amperage on home run number 1. Home run number 2 is this much. Home run number 3 is this much. So using Ohm's law now, if I come back later on and I figure out, I'm going to do some maintenance here or some service work, I can use my amp probe. I don't have to go look at the lights or anything right now. I can just literally go to the transformer and make sure everything is working. And this is how you do it. If you've done that documentation in the first place, you open the door, you look at that information card. I can talk about information cards a little more in the future here. But you look at that and you say, okay, well, home run number 2 had 2 amps on it. So, okay, well, what kind of wattage was that? So watts divided by volts equals amps, or amps times volts equals watts. So if I go, I'm top of my head math here, so my apologies if it doesn't pan out 100%. But if I have 2 amps on on home run number 1, amps times volts equals watts. So 2 times 12, so amps times 12 volts equals watts, 24 watts. That's pretty easy. So I know I have 24 watts of load on that thing. If I come back and there's 1 amp on that home run, well, amps times volts equals watts again, right? So 1 amp times 12 volts is 12 watts. So I know I've got about 12 watts of lamps that are about out. Maybe there's a cut line. If it's like a half of an amp off, that would indicate that it's probably about a 6 watt, which is a pretty average VA rating now in these LEDs, about 6 watts. So watts divided by volts equals amps. We'll just do the opposite. So just to show you, 6 watts divided by 12 volts is 0.5 amps. So I know that I've got maybe 1 lamp out, not 2, 3, or 4 lamps. So it kind of gives you an indication of where to start looking for a problem. Everything generates right there from the transformer and goes out. That's how you should look at your job. So whether it's installation, starting at the transformer, working your way out, you got to determine where that transformer is going to be to know where you're going to run your wires, and then you can go from there and cover your design and everything else, or how you're going to accommodate your design by where these transformers are going to be placed. Because figuring out the wiring and the schematic and how you're going to get the proper power to these lights, especially on larger jobs, that's something you really need to consider and go over your numbers, and not just kind of go into the shop blindly and start hooking lights up, and then you get a phone call, hey, my lights are flashing, or man, these are really dim looking over here. And that's because you didn't use your amp probe or voltmeter to make sure everything was working properly. So I can't stress the importance of that, guys. It's as important as ever with these higher performance LEDs. We're using real wattage. We're using real VAs here. So anyways, you got to account for that and make sure that you're accommodating for that in your system. For more information on that, give us a reach out. If you guys like this kind of a long form training or tech tip, let us know. We can make shorter videos, and I can chop these up and make shorter videos from here, maybe 1 minute or less. But I think that getting the relevant information out to you guys is key. So you guys have a great week, and we will talk to you soon.